Welcome to our 17th episode in this series, Jesus, our Sabbath. We are dealing with Jesus being our Sabbath. Of course, we've covered so many concepts of the idea of Jesus and how he relates to the Sabbath, him being the creator, being the redeemer, being the liberator of all of humanity. We have canvassed so many concepts in as far as the Sabbath is concerned. Now, in the previous episode, we focused primarily on the question of state law in relation to worship. Now, I wish us in this episode to just go further a bit on a similar concept, but this time around we'll entitle this episode Sunday in Law. Sunday in Law. We're still dealing with state law and the issue of worship, but we are zooming into the concept of Sunday a bit more. We will look into the concept of Sunday in the New Testament in the next episode. But I wish us for this episode to look at the law of the land, South Africa, and also the law as practiced and as enforced throughout the whole world, especially those parts of the world which have been influenced by Roman Dutch law. But let's first look into the law of the land here in South Africa. Now, we know very well that in South Africa, there is no day enforced in terms of our law, whether Sunday or Saturday or any other day. There's no law in this land that says that you must worship, take time off and worship on Sunday or take time and worship on Saturday or any other day. In fact, that would be unconstitutional if Parliament were to enact such a law. Of course, they may try to find a way around it by putting justifications of social well-being, interests of justice, and so forth. Perhaps that won't be a focus really for purposes of this episode. But a simple law being passed that says everybody must henceforth worship on Sunday or Saturday or worship this God or that God would not find a place in our law because, well, there are at least three sections of the Constitution. Three of them are important that would enable us to appreciate better. The first one would be perhaps that of Section 15, subsection 1 of our Constitution, which says that everyone has the right to freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, and opinion. So in our law, there is no confinement into what you can believe in, of ideas. You can believe in anything you want to believe in. You can believe that your God is a stone, is a rock, is the sky, is the sun, your phone, or anything. Maybe you yourself, you can believe that you are God. It is not wrong for you to believe in that as far as the law of the land is concerned. Yeah, there's freedom. Doesn't mean that you are right in what you believe in, but it means that you are entitled to believe in whatever you want to believe in. The state will not regulate and tell you what to believe in. So that is a good law as provided for in our Constitution. Another section is that of 16, which now deals specifically with the issue of expression, because it's one thing to have freedom of opinion in terms of your thought and your belief, but it's something else to express and to articulate that which you believe in your own mind. So section 16, subsection 1, I won't read the entire section in itself, but I'll just focus on this one. It says everyone has the right to freedom of expression, which means that it's not limited to these things, but it includes freedom of the press and other media, freedom to receive or impart information or ideas, freedom of artistic creativity, and academic freedom, and freedom of scientific research. So you can see that here there is no limitation. Well, there is limitation, of which I won't go into in as far as what they call Section 36 of the Constitution and so forth. You can't just because you believe in something begin to say anything about other people and denigrate them and so forth. There are some limitations to it, but in principle, there is a freedom that you have to articulate whatever belief that you might hold. I won't go into the legalities and what the limitation clause says and so forth for purposes of this episode. But then another section which is important is Section 31, which deals with cultural, religious, and linguistic communities. Now, subsection 1 says persons belonging to a cultural, religious, or linguistic community may not be denied the right, with other members of that community, to enjoy their culture, practice their religion, and use their language. Also, subsection B, to form, join, and maintain cultural, religious, and linguistic associations and other organs of civil society. So, there is, in essence, for purposes of this episode or this series, there's freedom of worship. It's not just freedom to think and believe whatever you want to believe in, but there's also freedom to worship. You can worship a rock, you can worship a stone, a table, a chair, a building, another person. Worship whatever you want to worship. And you can even congregate and meet with other people of who are like-minded and associate, form an association, and also to obviously practice in a communion setup, in a corporate setup, whatever worship you have embarked upon religiously. Now, this is, I think, just for purposes of introduction in as far as our law is concerned here in South Africa. We can have freedom, we do have freedom of thought and belief, and we do have freedom to worship. There is no limitation in as far as saying that you have to worship on this day or on that day. We are free, and we thank God for that freedom. But now there's also another section in section that deals with the interpretation of the Bill of Rights, because we have looked at 15, 16, and 31, which is part of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, giving us fundamental rights, which are essentially standard for everybody in this country. Of course, they may be limited in as far as I've said already, in terms of how it is practiced, but that's not for this episode. But then when it comes to interpretation of the Bill of Rights, which of course would be a task embarked upon by courts of law, Section 39, subsection 2 and subsection 3 say something important, which will take us back to our focus for this episode, which is entitled Sunday in Law. Section 39, subsection 2 says, when interpreting any legislation, talking to a court of law now, and when developing the common law or customary law, every court, tribunal, or forum must promote the spirit, purport, and objects of the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights that we've just cited in section 15, 16, and section 31, among other provisions, those must have a superiority, the supremacy in as far as those bills, those rights are concerned. They are called Bill of Rights. They are fundamental rights, basic rights that all human beings have within the borders of South Africa. Now, some of you might not be in South Africa really, but I think you would identify with some of what I'm saying because much of the law in the world is common in many ways because we share and learn from each other. But then subsection 3 says the Bill of Rights does not deny the existence of any other rights or freedoms that are recognized or conferred by common law, customary law, or legislation to the extent that they are consistent with the bill. So the Bill of Rights, of course, is supreme, is higher than common law rights, customary rights, and so forth. So much so that if there is a common law right which in some way contradicts, say, the Bill of Rights, then of course the common law right will be may be invalidated to that extent or may not be enforceable and so forth. I won't go into the legalities. But the point for now is simply that the South African law also has law rooted in what we call Roman Dutch law, because we know that in history, in Europe, Europe was, particularly Western Europe, was part of the Roman Empire, which of course over time disintegrated and each country or each kingdom regained or attained sovereignty. We had Britain, we have France, you have Netherlands, you have all these other countries, Spain, Italy, and so forth within Europe. But by the time that that happened, the laws of those countries had become infiltrated or infused by the Roman system during the time of the Roman Empire. And of course, through colonization, they came to South Africa and many parts of Africa and other parts of the world. And through that movement of people from Europe coming down to Africa, well, let me focus on South Africa. The Dutch came to the Cape and they came with their law, which had already been influenced by Roman law. So we call it Roman Dutch law. Now, over between then and today, we have now evolved into what is called Roman Dutch law. There's also customary law, which is recognized in our country. So all of these laws, which are not in the Constitution per se, the Constitution being supreme, but they do exist concurrently with the rights and the obligations and the laws that you find through the Parliament, the Constitution, and the different statutes and so forth. Now, for purposes of this episode, I want to draw your attention to something very important in as far as the influence of the Roman law is concerned. Now, before I come back to South Africa, let's go back to the Roman times. Keeping in mind we're dealing with the question of Sunday in law. The very first time in history where you find, particularly, I'm talking about the New Testament, and now I'm not talking about the Old Testament times of the Jews and how they had the authorization to enact and enforce worship crimes that I've dealt with in the previous episode. But I'm dealing with now the New Testament period of time. The very first time that you find a secular, by secular I mean not particularly religious authority, particularly in Europe, who enacts a religious law, a Christian law rather, to be more particular, is that of Constantine, having special reference to the issue of Sunday and worship. Prior to Constantine the Great, the first few centuries, the first century, the second century, and into the third century, the beginning part of the third century, there was animosity or rather hostility against Christianity. Christians were executed, they were persecuted, they were hated, and many times, sometimes associated with the Jews, who were also at times targets of political power and the politics of the time. So much so that Christians would at times find themselves wanting to distance themselves from the Jews. But earlier on, during the first century in particular, it would be the Jews who were the ones setting up the Christians and creating hostility between Christianity and the Roman Empire. But after those initial centuries, suddenly, Constantine the Great, who had, according to history, if you look at Britannica, the encyclopedia, and other sources of history, you find that he came to a point where he alleged or claimed to be converted towards Christianity because he said that he credited the God of the Bible as the one who was behind his military success during those times. I won't go into those military exploits. But the year 321 AD, now called CE, the new way of describing ABC, what was BC and AD, now it's called BCE and CE. 321, I think it was the 7th of March, when Constantine established a law in the Roman Empire. Now remember, he was the emperor. He established a law, and the law was simply saying that everybody must rest on Sunday, except for those involved in agriculture, as needed. So all civil work, everything, all work must stop. Everybody. Now, keep in mind, he was motivated, at least based on what we know from history, by his conversion to Christianity. He was not a Christian. He was converted to Christianity, and in trying to fight to make sure that there's peace and prosperity in society, that there's happiness, as he understood it, being taught by the scriptures. He felt that having the power, he should enforce and I would say criminalize worshiping on, or not worshiping rather, on Sunday. Everybody had to rest on that day for purposes of worship. Now, that was Sunday, of course, the day of the sun. By the way, the days of the week took their names from Roman gods, the sun god, the moon god, Saturn, and so forth, the stars, or rather the planets that we have. So all the days have some relationship with the stars or the planets and also the gods of the Romans. And Sunday was the day of worshiping the sun in terms of the Roman religion. But then, having become a Christian, he then found that since many Christians by that time were worshiping on Sunday, he then felt it appropriate that he should choose and appoint Sunday as the day upon which everybody must rest for purposes of worship. Now, that became law, that Sunday is a day of rest. That is why you find that in most, if not all, jurisdictions of the world where there's influence of Roman law, like in South Africa, we have Roman Dutch law, there is that special place that Sunday has in our law. I'll just give you two examples in terms of South African law. For example, in the rules of court, or if you want to, you can Google them and find them online, uniform rules of court. I'm just giving you one example, or two examples rather. It says in Rule 41C, talking about what is called service. You know, when you are going to sue somebody, you need to give them a copy of the papers so that they can have a chance to also answer and respond to your allegations in court. So the papers that you sue with, the summons, or sometimes if you are serving them with a court order that you have perhaps acquired from court, you've been granted a court order and you now want to serve it to somebody so that they can comply with that court order. Service, that act of giving a copy of that document to the other, service is invalid if done on Sunday. That is in terms of the law. Now, I'm not saying that this is unconstitutional and so forth. I'm not talking about whether this is unconstitutional or not. I'm talking about the influence of Roman law. But in terms of our rules, while some things are prohibited sometimes from being done on the weekdays and or rather on weekends, including Saturday, on public holidays, in terms of the counting of the number of days. If a court says such and such a thing must happen within 5 days or within 10 days, that ordinarily by default would exclude public holidays, Saturday and Sunday. But beyond just that general consideration of Sunday as being a public holiday or like Saturday, it also assumes something more special in that specifically on Sunday, you cannot serve a copy of a court order or issue or serve a person with a summons if it is on Sunday, unless of course the court grants otherwise, and unless of course it's an urgent proceeding and so forth. But then the other example comes from what is called the Interpretation Act in South Africa, which basically, unless a particular rule regulates itself, for example, if there is the Labor Relations Act or some other act that would, in its own terminology, define what a day means, whether it includes a weekend and so forth. If a law does not include its own definition, this interpretation takes over in terms of the how to reckon and to count days. Now, Section 4 of the Interpretation Act says, when any particular number of days is prescribed for the doing of any act or for any other purpose, the same shall be reckoned exclusively of the first and inclusively of the last day. So, for example, if a court on a Monday says such and such a thing must happen within 5 days, so you will not count Monday because the order is granted on Monday. So excluding the first day or that day. But you then start with the next day, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So it will not include the first day. But then whether it includes in this case, example of 5 days, uh, the rule then says, or the law then says, unless the last day happens to fall on a Sunday or on a public holiday, in which case the time shall be reckoned exclusively of the first day and exclusively also of every Sunday or public holiday. So you didn't see that Sunday again here in this provision has a special place, so that if the number of days that are accounted for something to happen in terms of a law or court order, then it would not count if the fifth day or the last day of that period is on a Sunday. It might then skip to Monday in terms of how the time is reckoned. Now, Let's forget about the specifics, but take the principle that Sunday has a unique space or unique place in terms of our law here in South Africa, which is not unique as well. It's also what you would find in many parts of the world, particularly where the Roman law has had influence. So this is just the reality, the fact that law has an effect. Being influenced by religious motivation has an effect in terms of the rights and the procedural rights and substantive rights of people in various countries. So you would find then that, of course, as well, in the US, there's what they call blue laws, which have by and large lapsed, if I do my research on the encyclopedia. Blue laws came about during the 18th century in particular, and many of them lapsed by the time the American Revolution ended. But these were laws, just like Constantine, that were regulating activity on Sunday, because Sunday would be recognized as a day of rest, a day when there should be family connection and communion, and also, of course, worship, going to church, and so forth. So, blue laws in history were laws forbidding certain secular activities on Sunday, and to some degree, similar laws existed in all the American colonies. In general, they lapsed after the American Revolution, but they did exist. But significantly now, there is a new push, which is not really new from that time and now, but has been there, but it's becoming more and more obvious in the American politics, political scape, in as far as the attempt to make Sunday prominent again, in a way to revive the blue laws, in a way following after the pattern of Constantine the Great in the year 321, when he enforced by law that Sunday must be a day of rest and Sunday must have no secular activities except for agricultural work. In a similar way, there is now a new push that you are finding, a significant push that you find in American politics for Sunday having a special place in law and practice in America. Now, of course, you might say, if you're South African, why talk about America and so forth? Because we are in South Africa. Well, we are living in a very globalized world, and whatever happens in one corner of the world affects other parts of the world, especially if whatever happens in a political, financial, and a military powerhouse as the United States of America. I mean, as I speak, currently there's a war between Iran and the US and Israel, and that is affecting the entire world or much of the world in as far as fuel price is concerned, in as far as food and transport, everything has been affected by what happened in one corner of the world. That's because of globalization. We are connected, highly connected in terms of our economic systems, our political systems. So we can't ignore what happens elsewhere because it may affect what happens even where you are. It is to that extent that I think it is significant that in the US, for example, at the beginning of this year in January, there's what is called the Heritage Foundation, which I would say, for lack of a better term, is a movement which is largely responsible for Trump being president of the United States of America in this term. And it is trying to push for an agenda recommending policies on various issues. And one of the policies that they are recommending, they wish to make law in the US. We don't know whether it will happen during this term when Trump is president, or it will happen perhaps next term or whichever other time in the future. As far as we know from historical records or in terms of what they have said and done, there is no timeline for it to happen. But it is clear that based on the agenda of the Heritage Foundation, together with this 2025 project. Currently, they are talking about 2050, America 2050, celebrating 250 years of America and so forth. So there are many movements and moving parts behind the scenes. And the Heritage Foundation, in its document, if you can Google it, go to the website, you will find it there yourself. You don't have to go to a library. These days, we have phones easily accessible to us. In their own statement, they say, published this year in January 2026, they do say that a uniform day, they propose that there should be a uniform, which means common, same for everybody, day of rest. They say that day limits commercial activity, um, and can provide temporal boundaries that help communities to set aside time for religious observance, family gatherings, outdoor activities, and rest. So it sounds nice, sounds good. I mean, rest, outdoor activities, family time, observance. It sounds very productive. Sounds like something that we really need, perhaps, in society. But how do you achieve it is the question. And they are suggesting that there should be an imposition of a uniform day of rest. A stable pace of research shows, they continue to say, that these practices correlate with better mental health, stronger social bonds, and more stable family structures. In fact, what they're saying is true. I mean, that's part of what God designed the Sabbath to be. When God said in the book of Mark 2, verse 27, that the Sabbath was made for humanity. The Sabbath in the Bible genuinely, truly includes such benefits as families spend time with each other, spend time with God, they get closer together. So all of this is good in as far as the object is concerned. We do need some better social health. We do need stronger social bonds. We do need stable family structures. All of these things are good. And they are part of the benefits of the Sabbath as far as God has designed in scriptures. But that doesn't mean, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, that doesn't mean that now we need to criminalize and prescribe for people how to worship, when to worship, who to worship. That is something that is not authorized of Christians in the Bible, in the scriptures. But yes, the language sounds good. It appears to be that which is we can aspire to and we can easily promote. But the question is, are we authorized to legislate the first four commandments among the 10, which pertain to worship? They continue to say, by restoring a common rhythm, they call it a common rhythm. So in the first line, they say it's a uniform day of rest. Now they call it a common rhythm of rest. By restoring a common rhythm of rest, now again, let's just pause there. What do you mean restore? What do you mean restore? Now that takes us back to the Constantine edict or decree that he made and issued in the year 321 AD or CE, which was basically legislating that everybody must rest on Sunday. And of course, they know very well in suggesting this that the day that will be chosen naturally is Sunday because Saturday people want to go out and do things. They don't think about worship or anything like that. It's more of a social time. Yes, also social elements are there as well. But if you include worship, most Christians, I would say 95% or so of Christians worship on Sunday. And even if you are Islamic or you are of another religion, there is a rhythm and a pattern that is already entrenched in our countries, which is Saturday and Sunday being time off, typically or generally speaking. Sunday more than Saturday, especially. They say by restoring a common rhythm of rest and reflection, community rest laws could help to reverse the trend towards spiritual homelessness and foster the social habits necessary for communities to cohere and flourish. Now, all this sounds good and well in terms of the desired outcome of such a law. But the reason I'm dealing with this question of I'm going through constitutions and laws and proposed legislation and so forth in relation to Sunday is I'm trying to emphasize a few points about the Sabbath. Firstly, what God designed the Sabbath to be in the Bible, in the scriptures. For now, let's forget Saturday or Sunday, but the Sabbath in the scriptures, the weekly day of rest and worship. The reason that God instituted the Sabbath is a reason which is recognized in terms of human aspiration. And it's a reality that you can find in any research you can find. I mean, any family that wants to stay together, to grow and to be stable needs to spend time together. That is common sense as far as human psychology is concerned. So that is part of the benefits of the Sabbath. It is a common sense benefit, I would put it that way. in as far as social bonds are concerned, which are an effect, part of the effect of spending time with God as designed in the scriptures. Now, that is what you see being recognized by some religious people, some of whom don't really care about the Saturday as the Sabbath. They focus on Sunday as the Sabbath. And they may not practice Sunday in the very strict terms as Saturday was observed in the Old Testament times, but they do recognize the benefits out of time off spent in a social context to connect with each other and to connect with God. All right. So research shows, in terms of what they're saying, that time off being spent as families, as communities, in such a manner is and would be beneficial. And it may be so that such research, properly conducted, really does produce such findings. I have no issue with that. But the question is, are we authorized? By we, I refer to the powers that be in any country, or even the citizens of a country through their power to vote. Are we authorized to impose the how, the who, the where, the when of worship? Are we authorized to tell people when to worship, who to worship, or how to worship? Though that is the question, and my answer is that no, nobody is authorized to impose and prescribe or criminalize worship or non-compliance with a particular worship, or even to instruct everybody to say that they must worship something. Otherwise, those who don't believe in God altogether, although I believe that they are wrong in what they believe, which is that there is no God, but it is not given to us as a mandate that as Christians we should impose religion on any human being on this earth. As I've said in previous episodes, we can impose limitations on a social level in as far as behavior towards others. There may be limitations there. And even then as well, it depends on the context as well. Because you can't tell me that I can't meet my wife, I can't meet my son, my child. Those are relational issues. But to criminalize a meeting of two people doesn't make sense. It's not within what the mandate of God has given to us. But I'm dealing specifically right now with worship crimes and worship behavior. That is not within the mandate of any of us. So, in as much as they might have good objects or purposes, in as far as perhaps benefiting society through social bonds, as they say, or whatever other arguments might be made, social arguments, economic arguments, and so forth, environmental arguments perhaps, and so forth. All of those might be valid concerns and objectives in as far as worship is concerned, or rather, in as far as social stability and the structure, the life of society is concerned. But it doesn't mean that we have legitimate power to impose and to prescribe and to criminalize worship one way or another. So, friends, in this episode, we are saying Sunday does exist. Sunday is a practically effective day that is observed in many parts of the world as a day of rest. Effectively so, although of course there may not be an absolute rule against commercial activity, but the pattern is such that closes, shops close half day sometimes, sometimes even not even open at all. Why? Because of the historical legacy of the act or the decree of Constantine the Great, who was inspired by belief in Christ, inspired by Christian practice at the time of worshiping on Sunday. But nonetheless, he had no authority to do what he did. Neither do we have it today. Sunday does exist. It is part of our laws in the land, but not in the form that was envisioned by initially by Constantine the Great. But some are trying to push for a restoration of such a scenario where everybody is forced having a uniform day of rest, what is also called a common rhythm of rest during the week, for whatever reasons, social, economic, and so forth. But I submit that we have no authority to do so. In this episode, I've deliberately not gone through various texts of the Bible and tried to enrich our understanding of Jesus, our Sabbath. We had to do what we have done in this episode in terms of looking at Sunday as practiced, as observed or respected in our various jurisdictions in this world currently, because part of what we are going to deal with after this episode will require us to have an understanding and appreciation of how Sunday has become what it is today. And of course, in our next episode, we are going to be looking a bit more closely in this time at the scriptures themselves in relation to Sunday and whether it has any significance as far as the New Testament is concerned. So that is part of what we're going to deal with. We'll also deal with in the coming episodes with the fact that as to how rather the Sunday observance came about, because obviously in the Old Testament we had Saturday as a Sabbath, but now we have Sunday as the Sabbath, statistically speaking, among Christians. So that also will be covered in the coming episodes. Until then, may God bless you.